Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues, where we strive to have the key conversations as it relates to the big issues in the history of ideas. Hence, they're timeless dialogues, whether it's something that relates to philosophy, ethics, politics, theology, apologetics, culture, and so much more. Now, one of the big issues that we run into with this type of approach is that so many people have been overcome with just a plethora of material that's out there. There's almost too much for us. We are overwhelmed by the fact that there are so many books that we feel like we have to read, that there are so many different philosophies to understand that we get overwhelmed in the process. So that's why I've developed this small approach called a footnotes approach to the history of philosophy. And in our previous lecture, one of the things that we discussed is that the history of philosophy, in so many respects, can be understood as a series of footnotes on Plato in the ways that they add to him, agree with him, detract from him, subtract from him, deny him, or so much more. And if one can have this basic understanding of these key thinkers and the basic ideas of those key thinkers, they'll have a means to understanding the ebb and flow of the history of philosophy and politics and so much more. Now, so many people recognize that ideas have consequences. Good ideas can have good consequences. Bad ideas can have bad consequences. And we're all familiar with some of the greatest tragedies that have hit the Western world. You know, the greatest tragedy that people think of in the 20th century was the outright murder of millions of people, whether it be in Germany or in Russia or in China, because ideas have consequences, whether it's the ideas that were found in a Hitler, a Stalin, or a Mao. Whereas there are also other ideas, such as love thy neighbor, or things about this notion that people are made in the image of God and have inherent value, and we should protect individuals, especially the weak and those in our society that cannot take care of themselves. Ideas can be used for good and for ill. And that's why we're taking this whole approach, is that in order to truly evaluate an idea, you have to understand where it comes from and what its key tenets are. And what I want to do is I want to equip you to have a basic, common sense conversation on the big history of ideas so that you can go into your workplace, sit around your kitchen table, have a ride down the road in the car with somebody, and actually be able to navigate what are all these different isms and schisms in the history of ideas. Now, we also talked about that this whole approach gives us this notion of a satisfaction that we can actually obtain true knowledge of something and the reality of what knowledge can carry in these different situations. There's a real pragmatic effect in the fact that they really affect the ways that we live our lives. If one's a skeptic or a hedonist, that's going to affect the way that he or she lives their life. Whereas if you think there really is something such as love and virtue and courage and honor, that's truly going to affect the way that you live your life. So let's jump into this here so that we can have a basic understanding of where we're going. Now, this is part 2, Aristotle and Ancient Philosophy. And we have this quote that we've said earlier, that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes on Plato. Now, I think a few things that we need to see from this, adding on to our previous conversation, is that it's a safe general characterization. No, we're not trying to give a detailed explanation, and we're not trying to get into every nuance. That would require a full history of philosophy course, which I would like to give at some point in time. Again, this is a footnotes approach. It's a common sense approach for the common man that it can affect the common good for people. In addition, it's something that relates to European philosophical tradition, and that's probably an overstatement. It's actually the history of Western philosophy, which Europe is part of Western philosophy, but So isn't ancient Greece and the Roman Empire and so much more. So in many respects, it's really a series of footnotes on the philosophical ideas from Western philosophy. So if you're looking to see how some Eastern philosopher is going to relate to this, they probably are a series of footnotes, but in just significantly different ways and beyond the purview of what we're trying to achieve in this conversation. Now, as we look at this, we've brought up this chart, which is a chart that was actually put out by Norman Geisler to understand the ebb and flow of the history of ideas. And what we find is that there are two main branches to the history of ancient and medieval philosophy, in particular, rationalism and empiricism. And last time we looked at Plato, who was sort of the picture, the form, the essence of an historic ancient rationalist who claims that knowledge comes prior to experience. It comes prior to sense experience in particular, and it comes from a world of forms. And we discussed his whole analogy of the cave and how we obtain knowledge of the forms and that those aren't actually something here in this sense particular world. We have shadows, and the divided line gives us that which is truth and objective and the true unity. And what we're going to look at today is this notion of empiricism, namely that knowledge comes from experience or from the senses. And probably the key philosopher of that tradition, the height of it, is Aristotle. So the contrast between Plato and Aristotle is really the contrast between the two largest rivers or streams in the history of philosophy, rationalism and empiricism. And as time goes, we'll break this chart out again, and we're going to see how other figures fall into it. But what we need to see initially here is that there are different types of rationalism. People arrive at these a priori innate categories in a variety of different ways. Nonetheless, they still affirm that general truth. And there are different types of empiricism. They arrive at it in different ways, but they're all affirming the truth that knowledge comes from experience, or the sense experience in that regard. Now, we also discussed this very famous portrait, which is from the School of Athens, and it's with Plato and with Aristotle. And we zeroed in on the fact that this entire portrait is trying to depict the history of philosophy and the ideas of ancient philosophy by what the figures are doing and how they're postured and the different ways that they're positioned. And I would love to go in and break all of this down. But for today, we're going to focus specifically on these two again, just by way of summary. And when you look at Plato, who's in the red, his hand is pointing up and there's one. And this is pointing to the fact that these forms, these absolutes, these objective entities are outside of the sense particular world. They're unified, they're real, there's something that are there, but they're not found in the sense particulars. Whereas Aristotle, the person in the blue, notice how his hand is spread out. And he's saying, no, they're in the sense particulars, and that the forms are unified, but they're spread out in the sense particulars. So the fullness of dogness is found in each and every dog. Whereas for Plato, each dog participates in the form that's external to them. And if you want more of an explanation of that concerning what Plato said, go listen to the previous lecture. But today we're going to look at more of what Aristotle had to say. So let's look at a few features of Aristotle. First of all, he's from the 4th century BC. In addition, Aristotle was considered Plato's most brilliant student. He founded the second university in history, the Lyceum, and he served as, this university did, as the first major alternative to Plato's academy. So what you're finding is that not only were these two figures the fountainhead of the two streams of the history of philosophy, but they founded the two universities that perpetuated the ideas of those two great streams of ideas in the history of philosophy. In addition, Aristotle did not found his academy during Plato's life, but he waited until after Plato's death. And we could speculate about a variety of reasons for that. And I think it's probably safest to just state the historical fact, but then deduce from that in one sense, there is an element of respect that was shown there. You should most likely wait for your great teacher to pass on before you start to critique his ideas and found an entire academy that critiques them as their main modus operandi. Now, as we look at Aristotle and Plato, we have to realize that Plato's teacher was Socrates, and that obviously Plato was the teacher to Aristotle. So the great three philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, are unified by the fact that one taught the other that taught the other, or Socrates taught Plato, who in turn taught Aristotle. In addition to that, Aristotle's influence was so great because he was the great teacher of Alexander the Great, who perpetuated Hellenism, or the Greek culture, all throughout the known world. But as we continue to look at this, the Middle Ages so regarded Aristotle, they simply called him the philosopher. Now, sometimes they would actually quote him by name. They would actually say Aristotle. But if you're reading medieval philosophy, in particular, a figure such as Thomas Aquinas, and he just states the philosopher, he's referring to Aristotle. And that's because he held such a high position with his ideas, and he was held in such great regard by the universities at that time. Now, what's of interest here is that there was a renaissance of Aristotelian studies during the time of Thomas Aquinas and around that era, both in Christian circles, but in Islamic circles. And that's because, for a variety of reasons, Aristotle's writings were lost to the people. But when they were reintroduced to the West, in many respects through Muslim thinkers, there was a renaissance of this empiricism, this Aristotelian tradition, that he grew to such an importance within both Islamic and Christian philosophy. And one of the key tasks of Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Contra Gentiles was to take Aristotelian philosophy that was being used by the Muslims and being used against Christianity, and to show how it's actually not a pure contradiction with Christianity, that it doesn't actually disprove Christianity. Now, we'll dive into that in more specific details in a later episode, but what I want you to see is this, is that the greatest individual who conquered this whole world, namely Alexander the Great, was taught by Aristotle. And the greatest thinkers following Aristotle relied so heavily upon his works that they deemed him the philosopher. So that just causes us to stop and to consider what this figure had to say. You know, big thinkers have big ideas that live past themselves because they actually changed the world. And that causes us to stop and to reflect upon what they actually had to say. And what we're going to do today is talk about how he differed from Plato and why those ideas were so significant. And there were other people who would criticize Aristotle. Clearly, he was not a man without his critics. Now, it was interesting that some people called him an anti-realist because he didn't affirm Plato's theory of the forms. And that's because sometimes Plato's theories of the forms can be understood as extreme realism, because it's just they're these external reality unto us and they exist independent of us. And if you don't affirm it in that way, you're somehow an anti-realist. Now, that's almost sophomoric. It's really just a naive understanding of the history of philosophy, because Socrates, Plato, Augustine, Aquinas all represent the grand Platonic or realist tradition. Simply put, while they're not all Platonists like Plato, they all affirmed the reality of the forms and that reality is knowable via the forms. Now, they may give those forms different postal address in an external world, or in the things themselves, or in the mind of God and in things themselves. Regardless, they all affirmed a realist understanding of the world and reality. Now, as we look at Aristotle, we have to recognize this. Aristotle modified the very heart of Plato's theory, namely the theory of forms. If you're going to understand the key footnote on Plato and his theory, it is his theory of forms. But if you're going to understand the key issue as it relates to Aristotle, it's his theory of forms. Are they outside of us, outside of the material world, or are they in the material world? In addition to it, this action modified every other aspect of Aristotle's philosophy, especially his anthropology, his epistemology, his ethics, and politics. Now, just by way of reminder, anthropology is the study of humanity, and epistemology is the study of how we come to know things. Just so that we're recognizing that it's not only what a human being is and how they function and the relationship between the soul and the body is anthropology, but it's how we come to know things and how we live out the good and what that means to legislate the good in one's politics. But what we have to see is this: since this modification is so important and in keeping with the Footnotes approach to this series, we will briefly discuss how Aristotle changed each of these theses in these areas. No, it's not a long and extended lecture. It's a footnote. We're going to get straight to the point, and we're going to look specifically at what he did and how it affects those areas and continue on with our series. Reminder, like I've said, they're footnotes. So don't critique me for not talking about some pet distinction that in many respects academics care about, but the common man can be affected without knowing all of those sometimes vain distinctions. Not the essential distinctions, but academics sometimes get on rabbit trails. So here's what I want us to see: Aristotle and his metaphysics. Aristotle accepted the existence of the forms and fully maintained that forms are the most basic and central concept in his entire philosophy. Note this: if Aristotle is a footnote on Plato, he didn't depart by denying a world of the forms or even the concept of the forms, these absolute entities that we can't get away from. He maintained that they're there, and it became such a central part of his philosophy because it undergirded his metaphysic, it undergird his theory of knowledge and how we come to know the world, his view of propositional language, what it means to affirm one's ethic, namely, what does it mean to fulfill human nature? If there is no such thing as human nature or the form of human nature, what does it mean to pursue the good of human nature? Namely, it affected his entire philosophy, his view of how we educate a person, how we govern laws, how we structure society. So we have to then ask ourselves, well, how does he actually differ from Plato? Namely, he denied the separation or the separate existence of the forms. Aristotle claimed that these universal natures or qualities or essences, notice all those terms can sometimes be used synonymously, they exist only in particular material things, and then in the particular human minds that abstract them from material things. So let's give an illustration of this. For Plato, dogness exists in the Platonic realm, in the Platonic world per se. But if we see, quote, dogs in this world, it's because they're participating. They're not actually, the form is not actually in the things, but they participate with the things. And Aristotle denied this. He said, no, dogness actually exists in every dog that you see, either big dogs or small dogs, fat dogs or skinny dogs, brown dogs or black dogs. They exist in the thing. But it's not just dogs. It's human nature. It's with trees. It's with rocks. Anything that has a nature, quality, or essence to it, those nature, quality, or essences are actually in the things, separated in the things, not just outside of them and as a separate existence. In addition to this, what we find is that it can also exist in particular human minds that abstract them from material things. Now, the notion of abstraction is something very unique to Aristotelian philosophy in this sense. If we have forms in the things, well, how do we actually know the things if a knowledge of the forms is required for there to be actually true knowledge? The form or the thing and the knower must have unity between them. And he says, well, it's through the senses. Through the senses, we come to see these, quote, sense particular things, and the mind has the ability to abstract that form from them. So it goes from having external material reality to having internal cognitive reality. And that's what he means by this notion of abstraction. So it's not, oh, that's just an abstract thought that's just something beyond and oh, it's unknowable. Rather, for Aristotle, abstraction is the process by which something actually becomes knowable. But what you have to see here is that the same form that exists in the thing is the same form that exists in the mind. But the mind also has the ability to communicate itself through language, to the same form that was in the dog that then comes in the mind that you communicate through verbal speech is the same essence. It's the same form. And as you write it down into some type of propositional form, it is all the same. There's a unity between thought/concept, external essences, and those thoughts and concepts and external essences as they relate to language, either verbal language or propositional language. In addition, like we've said, dogness is only in dogs and in our concept of dogs. But for Aristotle, if all dogs died and all men stopped thinking of them, there would be no more dogness. And what's unique about this is that for Plato, they would still exist because the external form would still be there. Now, one of the interesting things is that when you study them, there seems to be an element of truth to both. And we'll look at this at a later time in medieval philosophy, who I think corrected this problem by saying, well, there is an element of truth that forms are in the created world, and there's an element of truth that they exist apart from the created world. So how do we reconcile this? Well, forms are divine ideas, and God, through his divine ideas, in the act of creation, imparts those forms, namely creates those forms into the material world. So the Christian doctrine of creation and the idea that God is both transcendent and, in one sense, eminent into the world is a way that Christians tried to reconcile this tension that was found between Plato and Aristotle. Again, we're going to discuss that at greater length as we continue going forward. Now, Aristotle, in this whole metaphysic, affected his anthropology, his doctrine of man, his understanding of the study of man. And what we have to find is that Aristotle's anthropology and metaphysics are intimately connected. He didn't try to disconnect them or to have some kind of contradiction between them. He tried to have an intimate connection between them because the way you understand reality affects beings that exist in reality, especially if you're going to say a human being exists in reality and you're going to say what a human being is that exists in reality. He tried to have a great coherence between them, not a discontinuity between the two. Now, here's what we have to see is that since forms exist only in and with matter, so per Aristotle, so human souls exist only in and with human bodies. By way of contrast, Plato claimed we are composed of two different things or entities or beings or substances, mind and matter. And because of this sort of composition of the two different things, he argued in the Republic that even though the body may die, the soul is immortal because it's a different kind of substance. Now, what I want you to get here is this notion that forms exist only in and with matter. They're something that is conjoined together. So with Aristotle, his idea of humanity is that there is a material part to us. Clearly, we can touch it and feel it, smell it, see it, and so on and so forth. But what is the form of humanity? Well, it's the soul is the form of humanity. And what he's arguing is that with human souls, they exist only in and with human bodies. There's an intimate connection between them. There's a psychosomatic unity, the soul and body unity. But for Plato, there doesn't have to be that psychosomatic unity. Now, in addition to this, what we got to find is that Aristotle claims we are a single substance or entity, of which our soul and our body are the two metaphysical dimensions, the form and the matter, sort of like meaning and the words of a book. Yes, you can distinguish between them, but if you separate them, well, then your book has no meaning and you really don't have a book. And that's why Aristotle's notion of substances is that it exists when the form and the matter are an entity coming together. It's two aspects of a metaphysical feature that bring the one human substance together. It's the form and the matter. And that's not just something of anthropology that's of all substances. They have a form and a matter. Now, Aristotle gets into a lot of issues related to act and potency, and he gets into things like our essential nature versus, or essential properties versus accidental properties. And we could think of something like this. You know, if you have an acorn, it has the potential to become an oak tree. Now, it's within the nature of an oak, of an acorn to become an oak tree. It's within its potentiality, but it doesn't have the potential to become a dog or a cat or a human being. And that's how he's trying to deal with this whole issue of how do things remain the same and yet change? They remain the same because the act of existence in them remains the same. There's a continuity between them, but you can't deny change or potentiality. So formally, essentially, the acorn and the small oak tree and the medium-sized oak tree and the large oak tree are formally the same, even though by way of potency, they change in all these external ways. Or we could look at it in this sense. At the moment of conception, the child is of human nature. And as it grows in the mother's womb, and as it's born, and as it's 2 years old, and 20 years old, and 80 years old, its essential form, its essential nature has never changed from being human, even though it has the potential to grow in all of these other means. And that's what he's trying to argue for here. Now, this notion of accidental properties are very easy to understand. I can still be me if I'm taller or shorter, heavier or skinnier, white or black, if my hair is brown or red, because there are certain factors that are essential to me, that if you were to change them, I would cease being a human being. Like if I lost my rationality. But if I happen to go and dye my hair black, or if I happen to grow 6 inches taller, I'm still me, because that's a non-essential or an accidental property. So in short, we see for him, forms exist only in and with matter. So the human soul exists only in and with human bodies. And Aristotle claims we are a single substance or entity of which our soul and our body are the two metaphysical dimensions, much like form and matter, like meaning and words of a book. And that's why one key distinction is this, is that as it compares the anthropology of the two, Plato justified the soul's separate immortality, whereas Aristotle, and this could be something that people might debate, seemed to deny the soul's separate immortality. In one sense, it seemed like we were world-only creatures. Now, for Plato, he seemed to deny the psychosomatic unity. We are two totally different things, and it's almost like ghosts in a body, or house in a body, or ghost souls in a body sort of idea. Whereas Aristotle justified and defended the psychosomatic unity. So we're not ghosts in a body. There's a fundamental unity between them. And what we're going to look at is that Aquinas recognized truths in both of these great philosophers and reconciled their two desirable ends, namely immortality and the psychosomatic unity. He was Aristotelian in his doctrine of substance and his doctrine of man, and there are significant qualifications we will make on that. All of you Thomists who read Being and Essence and understand those distinctions, but he had the psychosomatic unity, but he also gave us a means for understanding the immortality of the soul and the reunification of the body with the soul after death through the Christian doctrine of the resurrection. Now, Aristotle's epistemology can be brought into this. Aristotle's theory of knowledge follows and builds upon his metaphysic, as all theories of knowledge follow and build upon one's metaphysic. Now, Plato was a rationalist who believed in the power of reason to know truth independent of the body's senses. The act of knowledge occurred via a process of recollection. And this is what some later philosophers classified as innate ideas. And this notion of recollection is this idea that you had a knowledge of the forms via your soul prior to birth. And the way that Plato illustrates or explains or gets a justification for this is in one of the dialogues, he has these slaves who weren't learned, they weren't educated, and they were asked a series of mathematical questions, and they seem to all of a sudden recollect this knowledge of mathematics. So where did they get it from? Did they get it from their jobs? No. Did they get it from teachers? No, they were not educated. Well, how did they get it? And his argument is that they knew the truths of mathematics by seeing them in the forms prior to the soul coming into this material world and being ghosted into the body. And this is the notion of innate ideas and one of the forms of rationalism in ancient philosophy. Now, Aristotle was considered a soft empiricist who believed that knowledge begins in the senses, but it's not limited to the senses. He's not giving us this notion of recollection. He's not giving us this idea that you see the forms prior to birth. In one sense, we're a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And in that, we come to know the forms through sense experience, through the effect to cause reasoning in that regard. But he was also what was known as a soft empiricist. Knowledge begins in the senses, but not all knowledge is just limited to the uncategorized senses. And what is beyond the senses? It's the forms in the things themselves. We abstract the forms via the senses through an act of the mind. Whereas hard empiricists claim knowledge begins in the senses. They would agree. Aristotle and the hard empiricist would agree with that, but they think it ends in the senses. And that's where we get modern forms of skepticism that are going to say there's nothing beyond our sense particulars, and we don't know causalities in and of itself. We don't know anything beyond customary conjunctions. You only believe that the sun is going to rise tomorrow because somebody told you it's going to rise tomorrow, and so on and so forth. But again, he's not a hard empiricist because he says that our knowledge is not limited to the senses. We actually have a knowledge of the forms. Now, the difference between soft empiricism and hard empiricism is the result of a different metaphysic. Namely, one is a nominalist approach that denies forms and universals, and hard empiricists tend to be naturalists or very close to naturalists, whereas soft empiricism affirms universals. They affirm forms. They affirm essences. And one of the key distinctions between Aristotelian sort of science is that it deals with this world of essences and this world of forms, whereas modern science, really coming down from Francis Bacon and his denial of formal causality and the notions of final causality, and that there's an end for which the form or the end for which human nature must strive, is the denial of Aristotelian ideas of science and his doctrine of the forms. And it's really what has become known as Occam's nominalism. It's a mental fiction when you try to, there's some kind of essence of a dog, but it doesn't correspond to anything real. It's just words that we use to try to categorize things. It's what's known as Occam's mental fiction of nominalism. Now, what we have to see here is that if the forms exist apart from or separated from, etc., from matter, then reason can know them apart from, separated from, etc., from sensation. That's Plato's theory, that the forms exist in another world, and through an act of recollection, you can know them, but the senses aren't required for the knowledge. In fact, for Plato, the senses tend to get in the way of true knowledge of the forms. Whereas for Aristotle, he claims forms exist only in matter. Then reason must extract them from material things via material sensations. So he puts it the opposite way. We must go through the senses because it's in sense particular things where forms actually exist. Hence, it must come from experience because forms exist in the things that we experience. Whereas for for Plato, they're separated from. They have to be known through a process of recollection. Now, Plato claims the forms were already in the mind's concepts. We already had them sort of prior to dealing with anything in sense experience. While Aristotle believed they were in the material world, and through the act of abstraction, they were being brought, or we bring them into the mind's concepts. In short, both agree the mind has knowledge of the forms, but they differ over how they get there, whereas modernity denies the forms altogether. Now, Aristotle's theory of metaphysics and his epistemology greatly affected his notion of ethics. Namely, what is the chief end goal or purpose of humanity? Is there such a thing of humanity? He would answer yes. And if there is such a thing of humanity, what's its goal, end, purpose, or telos? Just like what's the goal of the acorn? What's the telos? To become an oak tree. And what is the goal of human nature? What's its good? Well, he's going to say that it's found in its ethic. So both Plato and Aristotle believed in objective and universal goods, this natural moral law based off of human nature. However, for Aristotle, he taught that the form or essence of each moral virtue is a means between two extremes regarding the virtue's matter or material content. The content consists of both passions and the actions. Now, this whole concept of means is very important for understanding Aristotle's ethic. What Aristotle is going to say is that you have extremes and deficiencies, and that the means is arguing that one's truly virtuous if they're not too far on either extreme. And what dictates or governs or regulates that is right reason. Now, he's also going to say that this isn't just reason and reason alone. He recognizes, I would say rightly recognizes, that the passions, the body, the emotions, feelings affect the way that we go about our day-to-day lives. They affect the way that our actions can function. If you have somebody that's overly anxious, sometimes the emotions and feelings of anxiety trump reason. So for him, how do we get that means? That's going to be through his Nicomachean ethics, and we have to rightly or virtuously train a person to have the right action with the right feelings in the right way for the right goal according to the right means. In addition to this, one of the cardinal virtues is courage. And what we find is this is when one is feeling neither too little or too much fear. It's not either extreme. You're not overly afraid, but you're not under afraid. You know, if somebody is going to approach a lion with courage and they're not afraid, they're a fool. But if they have too much courage, they might be a fool in a different way. You know, somebody that is not afraid of the lion is going to get injured. Whereas if somebody's too afraid of the lion, well, they're never going to actually stop him if he's attacking or he's coming on your property or whatever it may be. And it could be a lion, it could be a dog, it could be anything that could harm you or something that requires courage. But notice this, and it's neither being overbearing nor too cautious in one's actions. The courageous person has the right amount of fear or caution. That means they don't have too much, they don't have too little. Reason has rightly governed it. Reason rightly calms the passions. It rightly informs it. And this is exactly what he's trying to argue for, how we need to educate children and how we need to govern politics and society. It's a virtue shaping process. The process or the purpose of education is to shape one's emotions and to shape one's mind, to shape the individual's emotions. And the broader purpose of society is to continue the same things on a broader sphere. And the purpose of law is to restrain those types of things and to bring people onto ultimate human good and fulfillment. Notice this. There, in each virtue, whether it be prudence, justice, fortitude, or temperance, reason imposes the right form onto material actions and irrational passions. Much like a cookie cutter imposes form on the dough. Reason is that which gives the shape, form, function, and so on and so forth. Now, I want to deal with one thing that some people say about this is they think that this is actually an irrational concept. Like, oh, you know, what am I supposed to do? Have some kind of means within, you know, immoral acts? Well, one of the things about Aristotle is this, is that if you go and read Nicomachean Ethics, he recognizes there are certain things where there is no means unto them. And interestingly enough, he even uses sexual immorality as one of them. He says, no, there is no means between sexual immorality and sexual morality. You either have it or you don't. It's on some of these virtuous aspects. And you can go find the quotes. They're there. I've seen them. I've read them. They're there. But a lot of people just have this off-the-cuff response. You know, what's the means between robbing a bank and not robbing a bank, or between being sexually immoral or not being sexual immoral. Well, those are sort of caricatures and false understandings of where Plato's theories are at in Nicomachean ethics and politics and so on and so forth. Now, how does it actually affect his politics? Well, first of all, we have to see this. Aristotle departed from Plato, who believed in the notion of a most perfect form of government, and he did this because he held that the rule through any form of government, whether it be by one, by some, or by all, could be either good or bad depending on whether or not the rulers ruled for the people or for themselves. Plato thought that there was an ideal government that we could, in many respects, have perfect governance. Whereas Aristotle was a little bit more realist in this sense. He said, no. All forms of government can be corrupted because all forms of government have people in them, and all people can be corrupted in that regard. So whether it's the philosopher king or some kind of republic or some kind of democracy, they can become good or bad depending on whether or not the rulers ruled for the people, right ordering for the right of society, for the good of society, for the bring about of human virtue and education and law and so on and so forth, or for themselves. And we know what tends to happen. People tend to rule for themselves. He also recognized that forms of government could be disrupted depending on whether or not the leaders ruled by law or by will. Are we going to have laws that determine things, or are we just going to impose our will upon people? And if the people were subjectively satisfied and happy as a result of the rule. Sometimes, if people don't like the laws, they don't like the rules, it's not bringing about somebody who loves the good for the good sake on the good end. So disgruntled citizens who are not blessed by government are sometimes or not going to be governed by good rulers. So what I want you to see here is this, is that the key essential difference between Plato and Aristotle is the location of the forms. And that affects one's anthropology on whether or not we're psychosomatic unity. It affects their epistemology based off of the way that we have to abstract things from sense particulars or get them through recollection. It affects one's understanding of ethics and politics in the ways that we've just explained. Now, very quickly and much faster, we're going to quickly transition into three other ancient philosophers. And these are going to be very quick because this is going to be the true sort of footnote approach. We had to deal with two big footnotes. Now let's deal with much smaller ones. And we're going to start out with hedonism or Epicurus. Epicurus was a Roman from the 3rd century BC, and Epicureans were typically atheists and materialists. So we see two different things there is that, first of all, within Aristotle and even sometimes within Plato, we find that there's this idea of the governing of the gods. They weren't atheists in the sense of denying deity, and they weren't materialists because of the world of the forms. Hedonism comes from the Greek word for pleasure, hedone, and they did not recognize the existence of the gods, like we've said, the notion of immortal souls or spiritual realities. So we see how these are all detraction theses from Plato. Plato was somebody that believed in the immaterial world. These people denied the immaterial world. Plato said that there's something more than pleasure. These people said, no, it's pleasure. Plato would say there are the gods, immortal souls, spiritual realities, and they denied each of them. Now, their concept of the greatest good is simply pleasure, though it is governed or tempered by intelligently regulated reason. And I would ask, according to what? Because if there's no standard, well, according to what kind of reason? Material reason? Well, how are the laws of logic just material things? They seem to be abstract, immaterial things, which is contrary to their whole philosophy. In addition, it's regulated by reason to ensure that it does not become self-destructive. Well, self-destructive according to what standard? And this is where Plato's concept of the forms starts to strike against this, because if you don't have a standard, the absolute principles, then what are you comparing reason unto? And how do you know if something is destructive or not? Just pain or pleasure? Is there no end for human nature? Is there a good for human nature? If there's no essential whatness to human nature, well, how do you know it's good or bad? If there's no standard by which it departs from, well, how do you know that it's going up or down? If there's no ruler to measure the distance, how do you know if you've gone an inch or a mile? In addition, for them, when the world goes mad and sad, one can still achieve pleasure or happiness by carefully cultivating one's own paradise in a world of delights, especially food and sex. So they realize that the world's going to go mad and sad, and the way that they dealt with it is by overindulging in pleasure. Hence, hedonism, hedone, food and sex, the two greatest pleasures. Probably drink, food, and sex in particular. In short, they denied the forms, reason was not governed by the forms, and they made pleasure the greatest good, not virtue as the greatest good. See the key difference? We see the footnotes. We see how this early approach by a hedonistic philosopher shows us so many detraction theses or detraction footnotes from Plato. Now let's go quickly here. Skepticism. And this is an older form of skepticism that comes from the 2nd century BC. And it's not the same skepticism as, say, like a David Hume, even though there are some similarities that may exist between them. This approach denies the top 2 quarters of Plato's divided line because it denies the possibility of any certain knowledge of truth. And we understand Plato's analogy of the cave and his divided line, and it just wipes away the top sphere of it. We're left in the material world that's uncategorized. It's given to sense particulars. There's no certainty. It's truly a form of skepticism. Now, here's one of the key things that we have to see. Ancient skepticism recognized that if truth is unattainable, we don't have to be frustrated or burdened with trying to obtain it. Rather, we can have peace of mind in a world gone mad after the so-called pursuit of truth. If there is no truth to pursue, well, then let the people who are pursuing it, quote, be fools. You just live in your skepticism. You don't get frustrated with it. It's sort of like asking somebody who can't jump over the pole in the high jump, well, you're never going to achieve it. And they just say, well, what's the point? Why even try? There's no use. Well, what if knowledge functioned like that? There is no truth, or if there is a truth, we can't ever know it. We can't ever get there. What's the point? But here's one of the key issues that we need to see. Classic skepticism, as in all skepticism, unfortunately, does not really end the notion of unhappiness. It doesn't actually get rid of it. Being a skeptic doesn't actually help you. What it does is it ends all hope. It ends the hope of actually having a real answer to satisfying the heart's deepest longings and the deepest desires. The mind needs truth, as the eye needs light. The eye needs light to see. It longs to see, and it doesn't actually find its fulfillment until it's actually seeing. Well, the mind needs truth. And when the mind locks down on truth, it holds it. It longs for it. It's something almost innate to human nature in that regard. But note this, Stoicism, Epicureanism, Neoplatonism are all alternative means to the same peace of mind goal. They gave up on the pursuit of truth for other ends, whether it be pleasure, skepticism, or the rest. So let's finish with our final one here, Stoicism. Now, Stoicism is a Roman philosophy from the 2nd century BC. It is the most popular school of philosophy, both in Roman and the Hellenistic era, and throughout most of the history of the Roman Empire. It was one of the dominant philosophies. It was something that, in many respects, to be Stoic was to fulfill the ideals of these societies. Now, famous Stoic philosophers or thinkers or individuals influenced by key Stoic philosophers include Seneca, the senator, and Marcus Aurelius, the great emperor. Now, Epictetus, who was a slave, wrote the most important book on the matter. And what we have to find is this. Stoicism is understood in these ways. Stoicism differed from Plato in these various fashions. First, Stoicism is not a metaphysic or an epistemology. Rather, it's a practical way of living, not a theory as such. Now, one could say, well, in order to practically live it out, would it have to be a theory? In one sense, yes, but it's not a fully orbed metaphysical and epistemological theory like Plato's theory of the forms. In that sense, it's a detraction or a subtraction, a denial footnote of Plato, because it's saying that we can live our life without a fully robust metaphysic and epistemology that governs human nature and education and politics and so on and so forth. it is designed, namely Stoicism, is designed to address the problem of attaining virtue and wisdom in a miserable, foolish, and unhappy world. And that's why it was so appealing to people and why it's almost finding a renaissance today. You know, we live in a world filled with misery, and there are foolish people who are unhappy, and we can be stoic and not allow the world around us to affect us and not to allow our passions to affect us. We achieve our goals by right reason and this practical way of living. Second, the means to achieving this end, this practical way of living, is to distinguish between what is in our power and what is not in our power, and to confine all of our desires and actions to the few things within our power, especially the acts of our reason and will, not our emotions or the things of the world outside of us. Again, there's an element of truth to this. There are certain things you cannot control, so you don't need to worry about them. And we recognize that our emotions can be fickle, and sometimes reason must correct our emotions. We should not be governed by our emotions, and reason can rightly correct them. But what we have to find is this. Stoicism viewed emotions as the main source of our misery and counsels people to either control or suppress emotions by reason. But Plato, in contrast, taught we could educate or train one's emotions and desires, first and foremost, by proper music. Namely, there's certain musics that are out there that wrongly shape one's emotions, that then wrongly turn somebody and govern them in different ways. And that Plato said that we need to, notice this, educate one's emotions, not eradicate one's emotions. And later, reason, as we grow in reason and understanding, can affect our emotions in particular. So what I want you to see here from all of this is that I'm not going to give a full critique of any of these. I want to just give a footnote approach. But again, ideas have consequences. And whether you're a Platonist or somebody that's Aristotelian, or you're a hedonist, or you're a skeptic, or you're stoic, we can all see how they are true footnotes on Plato. Whether you're going to say virtue is something that's attainable, whether emotions can be trained or not, whether knowledge comes from the senses or not, whether there is such a thing of knowledge, whether we can actually obtain something such as knowledge, are all real questions, and the way you answer them have consequences, good or bad, for the way that you live your life. So as we continue, we're going to jump into the medieval era, and we're going to look at the way that some of the greatest university professors and thinkers and philosophers who happen to be Christians that we're going to look at were able to be footnotes on the history of ideas. In particular, what we're going to look at is the way that this notion of revelation from the Judeo-Christian scriptures, the Bible, the Old and New Testament, affect the way that we understand these dialogues taking place in ancient philosophy. So again, Bill Roach, this is Timeless Dialogues on the timeless ideas that affect apologetics, theology, philosophy, and politics.